Morning, everybody. My name is Kim McQuay. I'm based here in Washington, D.C. with the Asia Foundation, and I have just recently transitioned to a new position, but my most recent one was with our specialty program teams. So my colleagues and I are delighted to welcome you to this panel discussion on harnessing local knowledge for conflict prevention and peace building. And thanks to Nick and his colleagues for providing this lovely venue today and hosting us. Just briefly, for those who are new to the Asia Foundation, we're a nonprofit international NGO committed to improving lives and expanding opportunities across the Asian Pacific regions. 2024 is a milestone year for us. We're celebrating our 70th anniversary. So our work is informed by 7 decades of experience, I can't do my math, and deep local knowledge. Program priorities include governance, conflict and fragility, climate action, gender equality, education and leadership, international cooperation. We work in more than 20 countries through 17 permanent country offices and programs across the region. So this morning's panel sessions one unique component of our work on conflict and fragility, and our broader work in this field, of which Nathan is part, supports local efforts to improve engagement between government and citizens, strengthens peace-building efforts and transitional institutions, enhances the capacity of informal institutions that provide justice, stability, and services where the state has limited reach or legitimacy. Our conflict and fragility programs draw on several core institutional competencies. Among these, a governance approach that focuses on political and other underpinning factors that give rise to conflict, insecurity, and violence. Deep trust relations with local partners forged through the work of our respected national program staff and teams, and cross-sectoral approaches to conflict risk and the spillover effects of conflict, which interfaces with our work on governance, climate, women, peace, and security, and technology. But this morning's program focuses on a cross-border local research network program through which we work with respected partner organizations in Asia, the Middle East, and Africa to better understand the causes and impacts of conflict in border areas and their international dimensions, support more effective policy making and development programming, and build the capacity of local researchers to share the knowledge in support of peaceful change. It's now my honor to briefly introduce our 4 distinguished panelists in the order in which they'll speak this morning. You have links to the bios of our speakers, so I'll introduce them by name and institutional affiliation. We'll be hearing first from my colleague Nathan Shea, the Asia Foundation's Bangkok-based Senior Director of Conflict and Fragility Programs, who manages the cross-border program. I just elevated Nathan, but don't tell Adam. Following Nathan's framing remarks, I'll pose a series of questions to 2 distinguished partners. Azima Chima, the founding director of Verso Consulting, a Pakistan-based collective of practitioners where Azima leads the portfolio on conflict, fragility, and violence. Mohanad Haj Ali, deputy director for research at the Malcolm H. Hare Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut, whose work focuses on shifting geopolitics and Islamist groups following the Arab uprisings. And then following my exchange with Azim and Mohanad, I'll call in Sophie Stevens, conflict research lead with the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office's Research and Evidence Directorate. And Sophie, the Foundation is very grateful to you and to your FCDO team for your generous financial support for our cross-border program. And then following Sophie's remarks, we'll open the floor to questions and comments. Nathan, I will turn first to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Kim. And thank you all for coming this morning on this very cold morning. I can say as someone from Bangkok, I do not have the wardrobe for these conditions. And also I know it's been a very busy week with a number of people in town with the events at the World Bank Fragility Forum and other things going on. So I really appreciate being able to take this time to share with you what the Asia Foundation and our partners in our network have been working on as part of this cross-border conflict evidence policy and trend program. So a bit of an introduction and to start with to explain what this project is and who it involves and various different components of it. And then I'll get into the topic of today's panel presentation. So if we, I guess, just have to sing out when we're on the next slide. Great. So the Cross-Border Conflict Evidence Policy and Trends Program, otherwise known by the acronym of XCEPT, is a conflict research program that has been running since 2018, led by the Asia Foundation and Chemonics, and with a whole host of partners, some of the major partners, which you can see on the screen here, and which includes our good friends at the Malcolm H. Carnegie Middle East Center, and of course, Azima. This project is, as I said, has been running since 2018, and working across Asia, obviously, the Middle East and Africa, so the Horn of Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, and also some work into Western, the Sahel region as well. The main aim of the project, and if you pop through to the next slide. The project seeks to better understand conflict-affected borderlands, how conflicts connect across borders, and factors that shape violent and peaceful behavior to inform effective policymaking and program responses. And we do this through a mixed methods research approach using field data collection with satellite data and open source investigation, various different forms of information to deepen local insights and policy insights into hard to access areas. And a key component that the Asia Foundation runs in partnership with our partners is the local research network, as Kim was explaining, which engages experts on the ground to build data, evidence, and analysis that reflects the local experiences of fragility and conflict. And that's really what we're here today to talk about, is not necessarily the findings that have come out of this, the work that we've been doing, but the process and what we've learned over the last 6 years with doing this work. So as I was saying, the local research network is primarily run by the Asia Foundation, as well as the Carnegie Middle East Center, and our partners in the Rift Valley Institute, which unfortunately can't be here, but have offices in the Horn of Africa, in Juba in South Sudan, and also an office in London. But more than just our 3 organizations is the vast network of researchers that we work with on the ground. And since the start of XCEPT, we have worked with local partners to develop a better global understanding of political, economic, and social dynamics in conflict-affected border areas, covering everywhere from the Philippines through to Myanmar, Bangladesh, Afghanistan, Pakistan, the Levant countries around Syria, Iraq, Turkey, and Jordan, North Africa, including Tunisia, Libya, and Algeria, and Egypt, and also in other parts of Africa, Somalia, Ethiopia, Kenya, Sudan, South Sudan. So we're covering easily upwards of 6 to 16 different countries in the work that we've been doing over the last 6 years. In addition to that, we've been working with more than 50 researchers from these regions to study and have collectively produced and published over 220 pieces of original work, linking with contemporary discussions on a range of development issues, from trade and migration to governance to climate change. I do implore you, I guess, if you have time to go onto our website, which is it's right there. There we go. Where you can access a full list of these publications from the local research network, as well as the excellent work that has been produced by Chemonics, King's College, Chatham House, Conciliation Resources, and everyone else who is involved with the wider XCEPT program. But just to quickly say that, quite simply, the project would not exist without its network of local researchers. Our model ensures that local partners have an equal stake in designing, implementing, and sharing their research projects from inception through to implementation and through to close. We work with our researchers and we ask them, what are the important and necessary questions that we need to ask about this conflict or this area? What are the gaps? What's missing? What do people need to know? What are the policy challenges or changes that you would like to see implemented? And what is the best way to go about collecting this information and this data? And how do you analyze it? And how do you disseminate it to different audiences, either at the ground, at domestic level, and internationally? And of course, working with them to be able to support those processes throughout from start to finish. There are, of course, some program limitations within this, but we are grateful to the flexibility that has been offered by the FCDO in supporting this work, and also the engagement of British embassies, high commissions, and others who are willing to take the time to talk through these important issues and willing to help us bring our research network into some of these international and regional conversations. So we go to the next slide. I did say I wouldn't dwell on some of the research findings. I'm not sure if some of you were at the Fragility Forum panel that we hosted yesterday, but if not, then I think that will be available online if it's not already to view, which does go into some of these. And I've listed some of the broader takeaways on the slide behind me. But I just want to say that our hope is that we are helping to change the conversation about conflict-affected border areas. There's a lot of pejorative perceptions of these areas that fail to recognize the dynamism of communities and the ways that they go about navigating challenging contexts, navigating formal and informal governance and economic systems to earn a living or travel for education or to stay connected with family. Resiliency is a bit of a buzzword in the development peace-building space at the moment. I think different organizations are still trying to work through exactly what that means for our programming and for and what we wish to take forward. And there's various different interpretations out there, but if it refers to recognizing and encouraging and supporting the agency of local communities and pursuing more peaceful outcomes, then I think that's something that us as the Age Foundation and our partners would definitely support. So what have we learned about the advantages of working with local research partners over the past 6 or so years? I wanted to share 3 vignettes from the Age Foundation's partners before turning it over to the rest of the panel, and also we have a video to share. And I hope this gives an idea of the work that we have been supporting through the XCEPT program. Before I make some final remarks about how the international community can better support peace and development outcomes through local engagement. The first lesson that I want to share is about access. And this, I think, is best encapsulated by the work that we've done in, if we can pop onto the next slide, yep. Is best encapsulated by the work that we've been doing in Myanmar since 2019. Myanmar obviously is a country that since February 2021 has been in severe civil war owing to the military takeover by the military. But even before then, there's been, for decades, there's been existing conflict between ethnic armed groups, ethnic resistance groups in the border areas of Myanmar who resisted the central authority of the Myanmar state. And so we have been working and researching with our partners these dynamics since before the coup, but really the impact of the coup in 2021 and then also of COVID in 2020, which shut down international travel and access in the country, really informed the importance of working with the partners that we do. And we've been engaging with the Kachin Land Research Center, which is an organization from Kachin State in the northeast of Myanmar, Frontier Magazine, which is a group of ragtag investigative journalists who do some of the best international English reporting that you will ever find on Myanmar. If you've never encountered them, please do look them up. And we've also been working with networks of independent researchers from Chin and elsewhere with other ethnic regions of the country. And they've been looking into the political and economic dynamics along the border and really helping us understand how those dynamics play out between different border communities, whether it's the Myanmar-China border, the Myanmar-India border, or the Myanmar-Thailand border. Obviously, some of these areas are hard to reach, and we've been very fortunate to be able to work with these partners to access areas in and outside monsoon season and along roads that have experienced landslides and other conflict and other dynamics, whether it's in mixed control areas or where there is other local negotiations that need to go on between paramilitary groups, the Myanmar military or ethnic armed groups. But it's not just about the area that they can access, it's also about the information. And it's about being able to do interviews in mixed languages, whether it's not just Myanmar, but local languages, being able to do more embedded types of research work, such as life histories work, which allows us to sit with the community for a long period of time and understand the decades of history in which the border region has changed and that they've experienced. And this is similar work that's also been done by RBI with oral histories work that they've been doing. But really finding a way for communities to be able to tell their story and analyze that, and then be able to work with them to interpret that into publications and policy discussions. There's obviously risks. Security can be one, obviously, with working in such difficult environments. But we trust and we work with our partners to understand that they have the best understanding of those security risks on the ground and how things are changing, and provide them resources and give them the opportunities to plan and alter their plans as necessary. I'll move to our second lesson because don't want to take up too much time. I'm probably already doing that. Sorry. Which is regards to analysis. And for this, I think we can really look to the work that we've taken forward in Pakistan and Afghanistan, along the Pakistan-Afghanistan border over a similar period since 2019, working with Verso Consulting in Pakistan, but also AXOR, which is a survey group from Afghanistan, and other researchers as well. And we've been looking at even before the events of 2021 and the takeover of Afghanistan by the Taliban, we've been looking at issues around that border, looking at livelihood issues, trade, the movement of goods and people and trucks, to understand how local communities, the experiences of local communities and the livelihood dynamics that are playing out in those spaces. And since 2021, we pivoted to a more less long-term research, but more medium-term research to really understand how the border is changing, how dynamics are changing along that border, given the Taliban's takeover of Afghanistan and the various humanitarian and security crises that have sprung out from that. And I think the lessons that we've learned is that in the moments of extreme crisis, such as the Taliban takeover, you need a solid and nuanced understanding of the context, understanding local dynamics and their histories, so being able to see it longer term, while also being able to see the bigger picture of the ramifications that are taking place and how things might start to play out in the future. There are, of course, challenges around this, and I think there are obviously biases in all researches that come through, even Western-led research. But there's a real importance to being able to support good research methods and making sure that the tools and methods that are being deployed in this region use best international practice, triangulation of data, and various other research approaches that I'm sure Azima will expand on shortly. The last lesson that I will turn to is about legitimacy. And I think the real example that we can use from this, and by the way, these are all a selection of the work that we've done. All can be accessed, obviously, on the XCEPT or the Age Foundation website. But the third lesson that I want to come to is legitimacy. And I think that that's no less exemplified by the work that's been done by our partners, the Center for Peace and Justice from Brak University in Bangladesh, and the work that they've been doing in the Rohingya refugee camps in Cox's Bazar along the Bangladesh-Myanmar border. This is obviously a very difficult environment to operate in, and you're dealing with a humanitarian and crisis that was very acute when we started doing work in 2018 and has been extended over that period of time. CPJ, they have the Center for Peace and Justice. They have an office 500 meters down the road from the entrance to the main camp within the checkpoint zones. That allows them to be able to work closely with the communities and be able to bring Rohingya researchers that we work with into their offices to be able to provide training and a safe space for various other aspects of the work that we do. We've been working with the Rohingya to understand the views of the population that are in this camp and how they understand and the situation that they're in. We began that progress with surveys in 2019, 2020, not done by Bangladeshis or others, but by Rohingyas, who were the enumerators that were trained and supported to go into and collect the information. And that's evolved into various other chat hour programs that we've run, including WhatsApp groups that span, tens to hundreds of people, which became particularly important during COVID when access to the camps were completely restricted to majority of Western humanitarian actors and others. So being able to keep those networks of communication and dialogue going, to be able to understand how Rohingya were experiencing the COVID lockdowns and the various other challenges and concerns that were coming up in that humanitarian situation. But it's not just about the collection of the data, it's also making sure that there's a feedback loop in that process. So asking them if the findings that has been collected by CPJ make sense, getting them to do to participate in the analysis process, and then also making sure that the recommendations that are coming up from the community are published in the reports that we release on the work that we do. We've also been involved in making sure that we're commissioning audio recordings of our research and findings that can be disseminated amongst the camps, because some of you may know Rohingya is not a written language. So making sure that the findings and the research that we have is accessible to the communities in the camps. And I think the real challenge is trying to navigate how we go about empowering what is essentially a very disempowered group of people who are stateless and refugees in a foreign country, who don't get a say really in how the camps are run or what types of recommendations or policies should be taken forward in the spaces that they have been trapped for 6 years. So again, I've taken too much time. I want to quickly pivot just to, as I said, coming back to how the international community can better support peace and development outcomes by engaging locally by engaging local voices. And I will say, maybe building on what Nick was opened with, is that I think the architecture is starting to already be there. I think there's, with the grand bargain, with greater focus around aid localization, the mechanisms to be able to give the resources for local communities and local actors to drive development of humanitarian processes are there. They can be improved, but the financing and the resources are there, and it's excellent to see. There's also, a strong turn towards local peace building, the more practice-based work that is that engages local communities in a peace building process that isn't just top down or delivered by elite bargains. But I think the gap that still can be filled is what knowledge or information are we using to design and develop and implement the programs that we're looking to invest in. And I think that hopefully this is a gap that our project meets, in that being able to build from and develop analysis and research findings that are coming from a local community, and using those to inform programmatic interventions going forward. But it's challenging, and there are some changes that I think we need to see, and that includes greater investment in horizontal development program models. So instead of having a top-down development program, ensuring that local voices, local communities are involved in the design, implementation, and realization of the work that they're involved in, and trying to break down those vertical silos that we see in the aid and development community. We need greater funding and program flexibility. I think there are models out there. The XCEPT program does go some way into trying to address some of those. But more broadly, there's a need for longer term projects, but that allow for flexibility within implementation, especially in conflict areas where there's a need to respond to emerging crises. And the last point is just on tailored support. And whether that's simple things such as admin and finance support to ensure that local partners have bank accounts and the registration that enables money to be able to flow to them. Training, bespoke training, not just ticking boxes, but ensuring that areas where there's need and capacity, where they identify needs for capacity building are met. And even the simple stuff around travel and visas, trying to find ways for local insights, local analysis to be shared in international fora, which is one of my great shames that we couldn't have more people from the Cross-Border Local Research Network here. But we do have a video of some of our network, and it would be great if you can take 5 minutes to hear from some of the broader network that us, Carnegie and RBI work with.
My experience with the cross-border conflict evidence policy trends program is a turning point, simply me a new lens to look at the situation in Yemen from different angles. Whereas we can see clearly how the borderlands today is shaping the central areas inside Yemen. So instead of having the central areas shaping the borderlands, we are seeing the way around.
We had the opportunity to learn 3 case studies in Kachin State and Northern Shan State. It's also provided us a new look into the conflict in Myanmar. So it's multi-layered. Depending upon the layers, the images of the conflict also changes. The more you get down into lower level, the more violence you see in those levels.
So Warawar is one of the historical borderline market in northern Pakistan. It's a good case study among the local peace market in the regions to understand how the borderland settlement and market, for that matter, contribute in generating local tensions in the borderland regions and also in peacemaking processes between the war-divided community.
Being a part of XCEPT has allowed the center and myself the time, space, and resources needed to ask and explore critical questions related to Bangladesh's borderlands and the communities that live along them. One point that I would like to highlight from my research and understanding so far is the importance of looking at both inter-community and intra-community conflict and peace dynamics. Our conversations with refugees and host community members so far have highlighted the importance of also looking at conflict dynamics or conflict tensions within such communities.
As part of Exporter project, I've traveled in the past several years to several border regions of Syria. So what I would like to see is that better off countries and countries with bigger resources not forget these areas and continue supporting them, not only through humanitarian support, but also by supporting local economies. So these economies on the border regions would become more self-sustainable in the face of the global crisis that we are facing.
Been one of the people involved in cross-border project, I started with the training in Kenya. There were a lot of participants from different parts of the region, different parts of the world. And these people came on with a lot of expertise, with a lot of experience, with a lot of stories to tell. And I benefited a lot listening to these stories, which also feed into my capacity. And after this training, I've been involved in collective and also some independent work.
I think it's been enlightening and humbling to have had the opportunity to work with Rohingya refugees. My biggest takeaway has been to constantly remind myself to respect refugee spaces, and while we're doing research, understand the importance of not being extractive in nature, to go in with respect, do no harm, and do them justice when we're trying to analyze the information that they've provided.
Working on the cross-border project was an important opportunity for me, as it allowed me to focus on the political economy of the Tunisian-Libyan borderland, where actually economic, security and political challenges converge. And I think it was important for me to interact with policymakers, with decision makers, to help decision makers also to get the sense of the real challenges that population in these areas are facing.
Okay. Nathan, thanks very much for your framing remarks. We're now going to pose a series of alternating questions to Azima and Mohamed with the aim of capturing a deeper flavor of their respective research work and methodologies and policy impacts. So I'll start with Azima. Azima, you've been analyzing political economy dynamics along the Pakistan-Afghanistan border for several years now, and through the XCEPT program since 2019. Can you tell us more about your research and the importance of the knowledge, understanding, and nuance that it yields?
And I'd like to thank Alliance for Peace Building and Asia Foundation colleagues for organizing this event. We've been working with the XCEPT program since 2018, and the geography that my teams and I work on is the Afghanistan-Pakistan border system, which I have said before, we refer to it as, we conceive it as a region, but we conceptually analyze it as a system in which we are looking at flows of goods, people, ideas across a contested border, which no regime in Afghanistan will ever accept, and which the Pakistani state is much more interested in hardening. So it wasn't until this event was organized and this question was raised, really, what have we done? That we took a moment to kind of pause and reflect and look back at everything that we have done under this project. And I realized that we really haven't used the same methodology twice. We've been able to innovate, and that has been, I think, in large part due to the fact that core research values have been promoted through this program from the XCEPT consortium partners. The fact that, and Mohamed can speak to this as well, the fact that we began this process in 2018 with a very solid conversation about using applied political economy frameworks so that the research was relevant to policy actors, to make sure that there was a very strong anchor for that. And secondly, to make sure that there was a strong thread of ethical governance within the research, that we were trying to be inclusive, that we were going to work with challenging contexts. There was going to be some level of agility built into our systems, so they would be adaptive and responsive. And where we couldn't do things like have equal representation of men and women in the process, we would make sure that women were strategically in much more important roles. And I think we were able to achieve that. So when we started in 2018, the first piece of work that we did was a flagship study in mapping this border, around which there was a lot of there were a lot of conventional myths around the border and how it functions. And I think we were able to map how the border worked, but also how these systems varied across the borderlands in Afghanistan and Pakistan along the north versus along the south, and how they had changed over time, because we were able to do this research over a longer period of time. We were then hit with the COVID crisis, which was another opportunity to innovate, frankly, when we shifted from more in-person methods of research, and I can go into detail in the Q&A for anybody who's interested in more. When we did that, when we made that shift to mobile-based methods, we had a strong back end of sort of stress testing that methodology. And what we realized was that structural exclusion errors, i.e. women not having access to mobile phones, mobiles being shared assets within the family unit, but also service providers not having accurate data of women in a data set where they're already unrepresented. So relying on mobile-based surveys was exacerbating the exclusion error in a very big way, which means that your data sets don't have a lot of value anymore. So I would encourage anybody who did these kind of surveys in COVID in difficult environments to go back and look at what's the actual proportion of women represented in that data. For us, we were told there were 25% women in the data set. They were as low as 16%. So it's so there are many approaches that we were able to deploy that told us something about how to do research, but also told us something about how to add value for policymakers.
Anna, the Care Connecting Middle East Center. Can you tell us more where in the Middle East you're conducting your research and the significance of the timing for circumstances and events?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for the Asia Foundation and the Alliance for Peace Building for organizing this. Carnegie Middle East Center, we look at 3 different regions within the MENA. One is the Levant, and 2 is the Gulf, the Arab Gulf countries, and 3 is the North Africa region. And within XCEPT and with the support of UK FCDO, we were looking at these 3 regions, but this happened at a pivotal time in the history of these regions. It was in 2018, and the whole region was in flux. In the Levant, we were just emerging from the Russian 3 years of the Russian intervention in 2015, leading to the end of the Islamic State. And these events were kind of shaping also the borders of these areas. So we're having new borders emerging as a result of these conflicts. The Islamic State had a huge land grab between Syria and Iraq. And so the forces that took over from the Islamic State were not the states of the region, were basically new powers. The PMF in Iraq taking over from the Islamic State, and also pushing away the borders of the Iraqi Kurdistan region. These shifted, and the Iraqi Kurdistan lost Kirkuk back in the day. And in Syria, the PYD and Kurdish, the SDF forces supported by the US took over that whole region. And in the north, we had 3 different regions. The Euphrates Shield region, which is basically controlled and backed by Turkey. And then you had the Olive Tree branch operation by Turkey, which saw new militias take over that region. And we also had the HTS, or the former Al-Qaeda, controlling a region in Idlib and its surroundings. And in all of these regions, we saw new borders, new security architecture being found through the regional powers which were in place: Turkey, Iran, and Russia, and in some cases, the United States, where the SDF were controlling these regions. And the border shifts, with the help of the XCEPT program, what we've done is basically we were looking at these new borders, and new borders meant new markets, and new border crossings, which were a major source of funding for many of these emerging groups, and a new security architecture, which combines, on one hand, these new rising middle powers in the region. And when you look at the Gulf was also in flux. You had 2 years or 3 years after the Yemen war, the Saudi-led Yemen campaign. A year after MBS rose into as a crown prince in Saudi Arabia, the collapse of the security architecture in the Gulf. I mean, the United States was the main guarantor of security in the Gulf region. And suddenly you had attacks against Saudi Arabia, UAE, and with the Trump administration in place, they've decided not to step in and play the role that they were expected to play. And so, we really saw a changing shift in everything. And as we were looking at these changes, I think the border project came at a point in flux, where the whole region was in flux. In North Africa, also similar dynamics after the Arab Spring, the collapse of the regimes of the Arab Spring, whether in Egypt, we had years of the Sisi regime, Libya, the UAE intervention, the Turkey intervention. These were shifting border regions. And I think what we've done in the XCEPT project throughout these years is to look at these different dynamics and shifts and see where we can contribute in terms of understanding, one, the new landscape of borders, and two, the impact on local communities, emerging new markets, the political economy, and the responses of these the rising middle powers. I mean, we always, in the region, when we used to design our policy talking points or policy points and trying to push forward change in these regions, we used to address, the major policymakers, which were not the same as those that emerged during these formative years. And I think when we look at, for instance, the securitization work that you've produced in Yemen, you've seen Ahmed in the video, part of our work on Yemen was looking at the impact of securitization on the local economies, and what kind of long-term impact would be. And I think when we designed the policy outlook in these regions, we also took in mind that, the main policy actors are not the United States or, the major traditional or conventional players in Yemen, but were the UAE or Oman, for instance, in Al-Mahra, when we were looking at Al-Mahra region on the Omani-Yemeni borders. And in certain cases in Saudi Arabia, we produced a major work on the securitization of the Saudi-Yemeni borders. And how, for instance, just an anecdote, like the security companies which were founded as part of the response of these new emerging powers and their need to use some of the local resources and locals in supporting their control and influence in these regions, is that they took them away from other sectors in the economy. So agriculture was not functioning, and so they needed a new flow of food from other places. And women were excluded from these sectors as a result of the collapse of agriculture in these regions. So looking at all of these impacts, within this changing landscape, I think was very significant. Specifically, we're looking at a phase in which we've done research for about 6 years in these changing dynamics. And I think, the body of work that we've produced has helped us quite a lot in understanding that shifting landscape.
Thank you. That is indeed a complex working environment. Azima, we've heard you describe yourself as a methodologist. Can you tell us what that means in the context of your research and how your preferred approach figures in and impacts on the research that you've designed and delivered under the XCEPT program?
Thank you. I think it connects to what Mohanad has just talked about, which is that this increasing complexity of the environment, but also that your lines of inquiry tend to spread out to try to capture all the various aspects. So every time we're looking at a particular research question or a research project under XCEPT, we're looking at essentially three policy areas: trade, migration, and security. And as Mohanad described, the security environment has become more and more and more complex. And we've also seen key paradigm shifts. So for instance, I think the biggest one has been for the Afghanistan-Pakistan border has been the transition from the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan to this interim Taliban administration with the fall of Kabul in August 2021. Since then, there's been, of course, corresponding changes in migration, but also a sort of an economic breakdown of the border systems. And with that economic breakdown, you've had a shift in market systems, in market actors, in trade dynamics that are very linked, again, looping back to the security environment and how militant actors in particular, insurgents, have been able to find space. So as far as the Pakistan state is concerned, they are dealing with two insurgencies that are regularly deploying terror tactics. One is the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan that operates under the auspices and spiritual protection of the Taliban leadership themselves. The other are insurgent Baloch groups, which filter over also, have a presence in Iran. In order to capture all of these, one methodology isn't going to give it to you. So for instance, a few things that we have introduced into the mix. One, shifting a little bit away from the large-scale quantitative surveys. They are a good snapshot in time. 3 months down the line, they aren't as valid. How do you make sure that what you're coming back with is giving you a little bit of depth, in terms of a little bit of longitudinal depth, right? And so what we started working on was cycles, with the fall of Kabul in particular, cycles of observation and research backed up by qualitative research in something that we call the Border Monitoring Initiative, which was an 18-month effort to monitor 6 to 7 border crossing points along the Pakistan-Afghanistan border. Now, in this, we were able to do some very interesting things. One, we were able to get data on the actual volumes of number of people and number of trucks crossing. The border crossings, we were able to find pathways of migration, irregular pathways of migration. And again, these were women-led teams in southern Pakistan who were able to do this discreetly by finding the routes that vulnerable people were taking to come in, and also what the rent-seeking structure was along those routes. So that we've continued, by the way, to use variants of these embeds and observational research methods to link them in with the more structured inquiry, like, focus group interviews. We've also used our COVID adaptation to get to a point where we can get more out of a focus group by keeping it smaller and more targeted. And finally, now we are currently working, at the moment we also have, we're trying to merge the observational approach with how we are looking at trade. So we have researchers embedded with trade trucks to try to see what the obstacles are and how these regulations are changing. And that's a kind of thing that can very directly give lessons and recommendations for a policy audience. It always depends on if the policy audience is receptive to what you're saying. Finally, we are looking at the application of AI in a project that it's actually a Verso project, a Verso consulting project that goes as far back as 2016, where we wanted to develop a better framework to look at antagonistic politics and how people are being mobilized around antagonistic politics. And that isn't just something that applies to conflict or, the traditionally understood conflict context. This is also applicable to, what you see in the US today or what you see in the UK today. We wanted to actually study how conflict promoters or extreme messengers are able to mobilize large swathes of people, of majoritarian groups, to antagonistic politics. And in order to do that, we're tapping into, well, what methods are available and what toolkits are available at the moment. What we've discovered is that all of your big sort of, people who are looking at data online, they're using established tools like sentiment analysis, etc. They're not there yet. Like the inquiry and the methodology that we want means that we can't just buy a service off the market that is going to be able to engage with the social media companies and get us those data sets. We have to train the AI ourselves. So at the moment, we are doing a lot of stuff in a cost-efficient way, but we are doing it manually. And the goal is that if we get a model here that allows us, for instance, to tap into very clear recommendations on how, for instance, the Islamic State Khorasan is expanding its message and how that message alignment is building across militant actors against the three states, which is the Iranian regime, the Afghan de facto government at the moment, and the Pakistan state, right? That sort of paradigm of fragility in the region for which the international community isn't as engaged on one side or other, right? But we need to understand how these patterns are going to develop. And then if we can do something like that, then, we can take it to Carnegie and say, look, how does this work for you guys? So we're calling it the Mass Anxieties Project, but let's see how it works.
Thanks, Azima. The AI dimension is fascinating. It seems there's no limit to the reach of AI these days. So glad to hear it's part of that. Mohanad, your research approach involves working through a network of non-resident scholars. Can you tell us a little bit more about that approach, and in particular, what insights and analysis it yields to understanding and addressing conflict in your region?
Yeah, I mean, these are mostly local scholars, so in-country scholars. For instance, Hamza in Tunisia, that you've seen, Ahmed in Yemen. So they're local scholars who work on their respective regions, given that we cover a space of about 23 countries, and have produced some research in all of these in one project or another. And so I think the significance of having in-country research is also related to their ability of building their own local networks. In this globalized context that we live in, there's a huge disparity within each of these societies. So looking at local networks and border regions and trying to develop the capacity of research assistants and local researchers from these areas has been vital to the work. And I think while our scholars can travel within the scope of these countries, for instance, Ahmed spent some considerable time in Al-Mahara, where they were working with local communities and looking at the impact of securitization, because we're looking at tribal links. And in the case of Mahara on the Yemen-Oman borders, we're looking at a region which spans on the Omani side, but also on the Yemeni side. They speak similar language, and they have tribal and familial links, sometimes siblings on each side of the borders. And so the securitization, as the conflict advanced, and as Oman was having anxieties over the role of the UAE, and specifically on that side of the borders. Oman has accused UAE of trying to organize some sort of a coup. And so it was a state where they had to harden their policies on the border, unlike the past years where they were quite lax. So in that specific case, you know, the local network was very helpful in reflecting these local concerns and how they saw a solution was possible. And so, for instance, we produced two types of research. One looking at the conflict resolving mechanisms within these tribal networks, in which the tribes themselves would resolve any issues, and the fact that they spanned across the borders helped in reflecting on that. And at the same time, we looked at the impact of these regional shifts and what kind of regional framework is needed and regional communication is needed between these different powers to produce a different policy with goals serving both of these sides' interests, and without changing the realities on the ground, without shifting the power balance that was achieved due to the conflict. So it was taking into consideration the pragmatic, the pragmatic approach, or the realities that are on the ground, and trying not to alter them, but at the same time provide a framework that would ease the pain and the long-term impact on the local communities. So I think having non-resident scholars helps in also managing, these local networks and helping us reach a stage where we can better understand these complexities on the ground, specifically when looking at areas where you have different languages. So, they're not Arabic speaking, the different languages, local languages that are spoken on the ground. And I think that applies also to the Saudi-Yemeni borders, for instance, that we've looked at, in which we had a local network that spans across the borders. But what Ahmed did there was also trying to push forward a vision in which Saudi Arabia can have some internal economic policies that serves its security concerns, rather than actually looking at a framework that doesn't fit with whatever the Saudi authorities were thinking about. And I think that was impactful. I think we're going to speak about impact later on, but I just wanted to highlight those examples.
Great, thank you very much. I am conscious I don't want to abuse the tyranny of the moderator, and I know that there's going to be questions from our guests as well too. So I have a few more questions queued up, but I think I'm going to hold for a bit, invite Sophie to speak, and then I can come back again if there's a break in questions from our guests. So Sophie?
Thank you, Kim. Thank you everyone for having me today. I'm sorry I was a few minutes late. We got slightly lost. It's a first-time DC visitor coming from another meeting, but it's great to be here. I am FCDO's SRO, which means I oversee the XCEPT program and our funding to that, as well as other research on conflict issues, primarily at the moment through the Peace Rep program, which looks at peace processes and transitions. Nathan had asked me to reflect back on some things that I found particularly sparking from the discussion today. So I hadn't prepared anything particularly scripted, but there were two things that really came out for me, speaking as a government official and someone working in this system of government diplomacy policy. You touched on various interesting things that to me talked about the research process itself in conflict and crisis. And I think, Azima, your last comment there on methodologies, Mohanad, you were talking about the actual mechanics of working between very local on the border research networks, researchers in other contexts. How does that process actually work? And then secondly, the sort of power structures around knowledge and information. And maybe that's an area that I had reflected on over the years before taking on this role, and I'm quite excited about what you described for that reason. But on the former, and maybe speaking a bit as a peace builder, not so much as a government person, I think what you've described is the power of research to also be part of the peace building process. And I just wanted to touch on a few themes that you picked up that I found kind of particularly inspiring. You talked about the long-term relationships and networks that you're building. And I think, just speaking from someone who's trying to see how our system can do this better, you know, the networks and centers of expertise that are needed take time to build, don't they? And the relationships that you all have, the relationships that you have with local networks, you can't do a one-year project and for that to come about. You know, relationships take time, trust takes time. When you're working in contexts where people are facing, you know, threats to their life potentially, you can't do that in a hurry. And I think that really came out for me from what you described, but also makes me excited that FCDO is willing to support these kind of long-term programs, because I think when I've worked at the country level, you need to know who to trust. You need to know who's credible. I think there are issues which I'll come on to around information kind of power structures that we sometimes struggle to move beyond, because those relationships and networks are not well established. And the only way around that, I think, is to engage in the long term in the way that you described. So that, to me, is really exciting. You also talked about research design and analysis and the way you're using all sorts of different methodologies, including life histories, to not just have an extractive approach. I think one of the researchers on the video mentioned that, and I've certainly seen that over time. You know, we talk about hearing local voices, and it can feel very problematic from an ethical perspective. And I think the way you talked about building those methodologies, not just in the data collection, but in the design of the research, using a whole range of different methodologies. You know, I would like to ask you, maybe as a question back if it comes to that, how have you seen that develop over time in the XCEPT project? You know, how do you bring people into the analysis process and the validation? Because I think often we talk about that, but speaking as an organization funding research, we're not willing to spend enough money on that sometimes. And for people to go back and feedback and engage in validation and analysis jointly with researchers and communities in those border regions, you know, it takes time and money. So I'd be interested in examples of how you guys have done that. I think the long-term relationships are key. I'm also interested in your reflections on ethical issues. You touched on that. When conflict breaks out, you know, I've certainly seen in Yemen, I did some work there a few years ago, the international community ends up working with the same group of people who can end up, I think, coming under immense pressure, and their own livelihood is at stake if they don't take the funding and the livelihood of all the people they employ. And I think there's some challenges there ethically, and I'd just be interested in, again, maybe putting back to you guys any reflections or recommendations you have on how to manage that, because often, you know, a crisis breaks out or a conflict cycle breaks out again. You have people like the British government desperately needing to know what's happening, and then suddenly spending all this money commissioning, you know, the same group of people who themselves are kind of surviving day to day. And it can be quite uncomfortable. And I'm interested in knowing how we can get better at that. Again, those long-term relationships, I think, are one element, but anything else you have to say on that? And then maybe, Kim, if I'm not going over time, one last one last comment. I mentioned power structures around knowledge and information. We've been hearing in the Fragility Forum about, you know, mental models, silos. We all know there are many challenges, and every institution has its own language, cultural norms. It's embedded in a particular, you know, cultural mindset. I feel that the work you're doing is taking the international diplomatic research community into a better place when it comes to, you know, when we talk about localization, local voices, actually privileging what information do you privilege, who do you want to hear from? And I think you're building a stronger research ecosystem that can try and break down some of those inequalities, racist kind of systems, being honest, you know, all those sorts of things that we struggle to get beyond. So I want to credit you with that, but also continue to think about how do we define it in my world, you know, what's credible information, who's got a legitimate voice. Just because somebody comes from a region doesn't mean they have the authority to tell you what's going on. And I think you touched on some of that, and I find that very interesting. Sometimes you're like, well, this person comes from there, and then over time you come to learn that that's one perspective among others. People have their different agendas, and I think you touched on some of the challenges of navigating that and how you're overcoming it. So I found that very interesting and something to take away in my own work. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Sophie. So we're going to open to we've got a couple of questions on the table from Sophie, but we're going to open up as well to which is absolutely fine. Those are all great questions. We just invite you to just to identify yourself by name and institution, and try to keep your questions reasonably crisp, just so we can get through a number. But please.
Is it on? Okay. Your expertise, your insight knowledge about the conflicts, and I hear a lot of encouraging words about peace building, about development. All these key words are music to my ears. I just want to share, I don't have a question, I just want to share with all of our friends and partners that Thailand, along with our friends and partners in the region, ASEAN especially, is working on two-prong approach to the Myanmar resolution, the Myanmar conflict. You might be aware that we are engaging all parties in the Myanmar situation, including the SAC, and other parties, to try to encourage them to come to some kind of peace dialogue. That's one approach. The other approach, which coupled together, is the scaling up of the humanitarian assistance to the situation, to all the people that we can reach as much as possible inside Myanmar. We have done some development work. This is music to my ears, that we have done development work, especially along the border, but not only along the border, Thai-Myanmar border, but also in the Rakhine state. Some of the development, some of the humanitarian work in Yangon area as well. So we are open, and we are engaging all of the players, all the great powers that have stakes in our region, in Myanmar. So we are encouraged by this talk, and we want to share that, and we want to ask for your support in our endeavor. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It's great. For that. Okay, seeing no hands raised, why don't we go to Sophie's questions? I think the first was to hear a little bit more about the feedback loops you have in taking some of the research findings back to the communities again for validation, and then also to the ethical dimensions of the research. So, Kazima and Han, invite out to both of you to respond to those questions.
The feedback loop question is an interesting one, and I think there was a moment when the border monitoring initiative that we started to do after the Taliban takeover in Kabul, it came about basically because we had done a large-scale study. We thought we understood the border well, and there was a lot of misinformation and misreporting going on in the international media. And luckily, having this community to bounce those ideas off was very, it was, I think, the key, sort of the integral enabler. Because I remember Nathan and I had a conversation about, well, really, what do we do? And at that point, we didn't have to argue about the values, right? We didn't have to state the case. There was already sort of like a convergence of, certain views, certain agreements or consensus on certain standards that we wanted to see. We weren't negotiating that. We started to think about, well, really, what can we do? And we then established, contact with the various XCEPT hosts to say, look, what are you interested in? This is what we would like to do. We would like to get a better sense of what's actually going on at the border. We would like to put out, rapid briefs. Every month, we delivered a 5,000 word brief for 3 months that was based on weekly visits to the border. So it was very, very quick for that kind of a written product to be delivered. And we did it, and the second cycle, we did it on a, like every 2 months basis, same kind of deliverable, but in the first one, we kind of did burn ourselves out a little bit. But with that, the cycle, like in designing that research on a cycle of delivery allowed us to build a feedback loop in, because every time we circulated a brief, for instance, in January, we also scheduled a conference with our FCDO colleagues, and that was the opportunity to build in that feedback loop to say, how are you reacting to what we are finding so far? What is most useful? Because the next cycle, i.e. which starts tomorrow, over the next 4 weeks, allows us to go in and give you much more of a targeted inquiry. There are elements of this research approach that are flexible, and we can respond to that in that way. Your second, if I may, your second question that you have about that political economy of information, right? It's been a bit of a problem. I remember in cross-border, there was a moment when we were actually, like, one of the research questions was that the main artery between Afghanistan and Pakistan in the north, which is Torkham, that Torkham was now a 24/7 operating border. And Torkham was closed for 12 hours. And officially, the policy was that it was supposed to be open. And there were colleagues on, one side of the border who were telling us it was closed, and colleagues on one side of the border who were telling us it was open. And no matter how many times we pushed back and said, look, the border is closed, we would get this response saying, no, it's open. And we were caught in that debate for way longer than necessary. The border was closed. But we had to get through that and also realize that, unless we really kind of stick to our guns, the long occupation in Afghanistan had created a particular environment where organizations felt that they were supposed to give certain kind of information to, Western governments. And it took us a while to get away from that. There was a lot of noise in data. There are a lot of things that are considered normative, i.e., sort of women being harassed and abused at certain border crossings. Now, while I am absolutely sure that that does happen, when it comes through in the data set, we got 0 first-hand accounts. None. They're all second or third-hand accounts of I heard this happen to XYZ. So you have to establish those standards for yourself in terms of what you are going to qualify as noise. And anything that comes through as noise and you put it in that box, it is a decision about whether you want to go and investigate it further. There is a way to do that. There is a way to spend a little bit of that extra money and pivot around and find a new set of people to go and validate and verify. But we spend a lot of time doing things like that. So hope that helps.
Thanks, Azima. Mahana, would you like to speak to either of those questions?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of getting the feedback from, I'd like to speak about the second point first, and then the first one. So in the other order, because it's a very important question looking at the structures that we have and how exclusionary they are in so many ways. And specifically, even if you have, say, a scholar from Tunisia going to work on the border regions, the disparity and the gap between populations are so massive. We're looking at different peoples within the same country, even within the same neighborhood. Like I live away from 2 streets away from the Palestinian refugee camp Sabra in Beirut. And I have electricity about 15, 16 hours a day. I have access to water. I have some internet. It's not great, but I do have some access to internet. But when you cross the street, literally, it's just 2 minutes away. you get into a place where basically, basic services are not available. Access to toilets is not there. Internet services are non-existent. It's a totally different world within the same squared kilometer. And the local voices there are really needed to, and also when looking at local voices, I think going back to the great point that Azima in Arabic means great, but I think it's a double it's a double hit there. But it's a great point about the exclusion of women. And I'll give you an example of one of our Saudi scholars. She works on Iraq. She's been working on Iraq for many, many years. And she went to the western borders of Iraq, where ISIS was there and just in the post-Islamic State phase. And her driver took her to the from Baghdad to that region in western Iraq, where it's a very conservative region. She was interviewing on the way some tribal leaders, and she was going to see 2-3 tribal leaders in that conservative region. And when she reached Heat, the tribal leaders saw her and they were surprised to see a woman as a researcher. So they received the male driver and they sent her into the kitchen to speak with the woman there. And she actually had like great insights from the women in there, much more valuable than speaking to these tribal leaders.
Exactly.
Honestly, and on that level. And I think, the nuances that she received, and I think were quite significant, and they made us rethink our approach to how to do interviews in that region and how to approach it. And so we were going more to the kitchen side of things and doing the interviews there and working with female researchers have been useful in that side of things. But just to move on to the feedback side of things, I think we publish both in Arabic and in English. So, all of our XCEPT work, all the body of XCEPT work has been published in both languages. And on Yemen, for instance, when we've done our work on Mahara and also specifically on the Saudi-Yemeni borders, Al Jazeera took the work and published a video of them. And many people in that region watch Al Jazeera. And so we received a lot of feedback and from people, and Ahmed received phone calls on his work. And I think his interaction with the local media, because Ahmed was doing something which was interesting, which is that he goes and he does his field work, semi-structured interviews and focus groups, and works with the local researchers. But what he does after finishing his field work, he comes back, being from Yemen and coming from a lower middle class background in that region, is that he writes feature stories in Arabic about the cases that he has seen and does a lot of work in trying to put an image to whatever he's seeing in these regions and the impact of the conflict on local communities. And he mixes that with some of the research findings that he has. And so I think these have reached a much wider audience than the research work and even the Al Jazeera videos. And I always make it a point to go. I used to go to his Facebook page, and see them, because Facebook is big in Yemen as it is in much of the Arab region, and I see the interactions, and specifically from the regions that he was working on. I think that's always a useful tool to think about what kind of outreach and design specifically to reach these communities, given their socioeconomic realities.
Great, thank you. 2 great anecdotes, the first of which stirs some echoes of my years in Bangladesh as well, too, and interviewing women from whom the most important information invariably came. Other questions? Yes.
My name is Meta Fastball Jensen. I'm the Deputy Director of XCEPT. So apologies for jumping in. I have opportunity to speak with these guys outside of this as well. But I think in this forum, given the topic of this session, one issue that I'm interested in sort of more generally also is around research as process. And I think what that means also research as a lever in local context. And I think we have examples, and pardon me for making a plug for the website and another project that's run under XCEPT on the Uganda-Kenya border. It's led by the Institute for Development Studies, but working very much with local pastoralist researchers, where there's been an interesting example of how their leadership of the research process itself, both the data collection, but very much also in the analysis and articulation of the findings, has fed back into the communities in a way where it's helped them articulate what they're looking for, what their problems mean, and taking those to government authorities in those areas. So it's sort of become this kind of, the research process itself has fed into a peace process, if you will. And I think there are other examples of that where the research process itself has become a quite interesting and quite powerful tool in feeding into peace dialogues, if you will, or dialogues about what they're doing on in the tensions in particular contexts. And I wonder also, in your experience of working in areas with local tensions, if you can speak to the way in which, I mean, the local research network in particular, right, the places you in a lot of contexts where that it presents both opportunities and challenges. There is part of the risk in these contexts, right, is the perhaps inconvenient, shall we say, findings that you come up with that maybe do not echo with local government authorities, but may also present opportunities for engaging with those local authorities that have tremendous amounts of influence on how things play out there. I wonder if you can speak to how you navigate that, the opportunities and the sort of challenges of bringing the research back in the context. We talk a lot about, we don't want the research to be extractive, although in practice, right, a lot of our audience is sort of policymakers, if you will, but there is a local audience as well, and that presents particular challenges for how we engage with the research and policymakers. But I hope that there's a question in there that I'm sort of clustering up.
That's great. Thank you. There was a second hand. Let's get one more question on the table as well, too, and then we'll invite our panelists to respond.
Yes, sorry, it's capturing the audio. Everyone's confused what's going on.
Yelling into the microphone. My name is Kirsten Caesar, and currently I'm an independent contractor looking for my next opportunity, but have a background in the U.S. military and working in international development now in conflict regions. I've heard a lot at the Fragility Forum around cross-border nations and just border areas with peace building efforts and preventing violent extremism and such. And I'm wondering, without having this extractive research mindset and having an ethical lens, what are some of the practical incentives to get stakeholders to the table to really find the right people to conduct research or just operate in those areas? What are, some of the incentives? Thank you.
If I can, I'm going to piggyback one question onto the first question from our colleague from XCEPT, and that is, in addition to the research feeding into the peace process, we had queued up a set of questions about policy as well too. Maybe if you could just weave into your response the policy dimensions, the policy impact of the research, and if there's any anecdote you can punctuate that with.
So if I get you correctly, Mette, you're talking about the engaging with local authorities and in terms of how that research is giving them back. So in our case, because there were so many restrictions on trade, and the market systems were so disrupted, but also traders were really, really, really struggling. They really engaged with us
and also try to find ways through, we supplemented because some of our researchers are very established journalists, so they were able to get some of those stories of interest for, traders out there in the media as well. We also know that for district officials who actually were supportive of the local protest in the local conflict dimensions that we were studying around the border systems, they were quite supportive of the protesters, couldn't say it officially. They gave us a lot of information and the details of the people who they wanted us to take and weave into our interview process. So we did that. And there's also then, things that we heard where at some points our reports came back to us from senior officials at ministries saying, look, we saw your report, we love it, we agree with it, but we need to do something internally. We can't seem to be citing your report. So can you help us, just give us some advice or give us, some of the researchers. So that's how it's working in a very, very highly regulated, securitized context like Pakistan. So I think that speaks both to the policy dimension as well as,
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the local reconciling the local agenda and also what the policy world or what the Western side of things is looking for. And I think it was just helpful, in the XCEPT program is basically Sophie and Lydia and Charlie before her, she spoke about the different hats that you put on. It's a peace builder, it's a researcher also, and as someone who's in the UK FCDO, and many times they took off the UK FCDO hat and gave us some inner kind of advice on how to approach the policy world. And I think that was because it's a long-term project, and I think we've had quite some time to do many things. One, basically to build the local networks that we've built, but also to understand how our research did not really reach the desk of the people that, we wanted, in certain cases, we wanted them to reach. Of course, we think about impact in many different ways. One, in terms of engaging with the different stakeholders in the media, for instance, and getting the message out in Arabic and in certain cases in English as well. But also in our briefings that we provide, whether with the UK FCDO and other relevant policymakers, specifically, for instance, in our case, because we were working on Yemen and Syria, there were UN missions working on this, and they were engaging with our research, sending us emails saying, we've read this work and we have a briefing, inviting us to events in which they were discussing this. So it's part of the, informative decision-making, the big slogan that think tanks, try to guide themselves with, in which, this is a changing landscape with many players. We were talking about the rising, middle powers that they're trying to achieve themselves as policymakers in these regions. And I think it's very important to target those as well. And that did reach them in Arabic, one way or the other. And, of course, we're not able to say that, pinpoint, as she said, that they, none of these players would like to say, okay, this research really impacted our policy here and there. But I think we were very mindful of their role, and we were trying to provide middleways, even in places like Algeria and Morocco. We had a 2018 paper on the border region between Algeria and Morocco, and said that, we're aware that they don't like to deal with each other and cooperate on the border regions. But we provided ways, being mindful of that, we provided ways in which they can tacitly cooperate, given that they're both so worried about the drug trade happening on the border regions with smuggling and, through the holes that were on that border region. And so I think, it's something that you need to also build within your research project as you're building your outline and your research design and being mindful of what kind of impact you can have in this particular research. And also, you know, I think the big slogan that we have, if you're not going to promote it, don't write it. You know, if you're not going to, you know, write that piece and have it on a banner and go out and try to spread the message and try to push the policy points that you found there, you're not going to get it. But just one last point on the challenges of working with local researchers in this security conflict region. I mean, we were in a conflict area where people were being assassinated all the time, and you know, we've lost one of the local researchers that we were working on. He was quite vocal on the popular mobilization forces. He was out on the media, always speaking about them, etc. There was waves of killings in these regions. So I think it's very challenging and had an impact on all of us. And I think thinking deeper about security challenges is very, very, very important. Of course, you can't control the medium that you work in, and the fact that you have large portions of the populations being decimated in these conflicts. But I think it's very significant part of our work, and we need to be very mindful of.
Thanks very much, and especially for registering that last point. That's an extraordinarily important one. Nathan, is there anything that you would add to the questions that have been raised before we wind up?
I'm going to take 30 seconds because we've already run out of time, but just you're talking about, I guess, stakeholders and working. I think it's still incredibly difficult. Our systems are not structured to, we think about conflicts, especially conflicts in border areas, not as issues that are inherent to one nation, one domestic setting, but something that is a system that crosses borders, but then also has linkages, you know, beyond and far the way in which goods or other things connect. But then you get to a situation where you have to brief one embassy and then or brief another embassy, and they're not even, you know, they're hardly even talking to each other about a conflict in a border area. And so you have a conversation, slightly hypothetical conversation about example of, you know, having a conversation with the British embassy in Yangon about the conflict in Chin State on the India border, and then maybe having another conversation with the embassy in Delhi about the same conflict separately. Trying to bring those different stakeholders together is incredibly difficult. I think we're getting a little bit better. I know that the UK government certainly will speak with great authority to this than me.
Wow.
But you know, there are task force, for example, there are mechanisms which bring different yeah, there are task forces, for example, of people working on the Rohingya issue coming from the Myanmar side, Bangladesh side, elsewhere, bringing stakeholders together. And I think in severe crises, there's more of that going on, but there's definitely ways that can be done at a horizontal level and a vertical level once.
Thank you, Nathan. That wasn't the closing bell or bomb over there, but but Sophie, if there's anything that you'd like, last word that you'd like to add?
I mean, just a one line, because I think you know the point you made there, Nathan, and Meta's point on the research process and what it can bring. And I just, you know, credit all of you with the work that you're doing, but also excited to be involved in something which I can see, like you described, can be part of the peace process and can also be part of the process of bringing stakeholders together, even within my own government or, you know, the international community, national governments around a region. So I think the XCEPT program is very powerful in that way, because as I heard in a session a few days ago, you know, people aren't bad, they're busy. It's not that people don't know that these are problems or don't want to work on them, but we all have our own jobs and pressures. And I think what you do actually creates space at many levels, be it the local level, with authorities across borders, with different embassies, to come together and address these problems in a way that will be more effective and responsive to what's actually going on. So I think that's really powerful, and it's been great to be part of the conversation.
Thanks so much. I'd like to first thank all of you who were able to join us this morning. We appreciate that everybody's busy with their with their day jobs. We're really grateful that you could spare time and hope you enjoyed the program. And I'd like to invite our guests to join me in a round of thanks to our panelists. It's been a really fascinating session. We've learned a lot. As Nathan intimated at the beginning, there's a vast website of resources. So you've had a little bit of a snapshot of this work, but I encourage you to visit the website and dive into some of the research pieces at your leisure.